There's a number that quietly separates people who feel financially anxious from people who don't, and it has almost nothing to do with what they earn. Here is the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. A raise changes your monthly cash flow. $100,000 in savings changes your financial identity. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the most common reasons people feel like they are always making progress but never actually arriving anywhere. This channel is about understanding how money actually behaves, not how we imagine it does. And today we are going to look at why crossing that $100,000 threshold tends to shift something much deeper than your bank balance. Let's start with what a raise actually does. When you get a pay increase, your income goes up. Let's say you are earning 60,000 and you get bumped to 67. That is 7,000 more dollars a year before tax. After tax, depending on where you live, you might take home an extra $400 or $500 a month. That is genuinely useful. It covers a bill, maybe builds a small buffer, reduces the low-grade stress of tight months. But here's what also tends to happen. Your spending adjusts. Not always dramatically, not always consciously, but gradually. A slightly nicer grocery run here. A subscription you no longer feel guilty about there. Economists call this lifestyle inflation, but it does not even need to be reckless spending. It is just what happens when a little more room appears. The pressure eases and the habits fill the space. The raise improves your situation. It rarely transforms it. Now let's look at what $100,000 in savings or investments actually does differently. The first and most practical thing is that it generates returns that are starting to become visible. At a 7% average annual return, $100,000 produces roughly $7,000 in growth over the course of a year. You did not work for that. You did not earn it through hours or effort. It just happened because the money was there, doing its thing. $7,000 a year is about $580 a month, which, if you think about it, is roughly what many people would take home from a meaningful pay raise. Except this version does not require performance review, does not get spent in the same psychological way earned income does, and compounds going forward. That is the part nobody really explains properly. When your investment account grows from 100,000 to 107,000, next year's 7% is calculated on 107,000. The year after that, on more still. Your raise stays roughly fixed. Your returns mathematically keep growing. Over years and decades, these two paths diverge in a way that is genuinely hard to fully grasp until you see it. It's not really about the number itself. It's more about what that number represents, which is the point where money starts contributing meaningfully to your financial life, rather than you doing all the heavy lifting alone. Now here's where the psychology gets interesting, because this is the part that actually drives behavior. For most people, the journey to 100,000 is genuinely hard. Not because it requires some advanced financial strategy, but because it requires doing something boring and uncomfortable for years without much visible reward. When you have 5,000 saved, the returns are almost invisible. When you have 20,000, they are slightly less invisible but still feel small. The math is technically working the whole time. It just does not feel like it, so people get discouraged. Or they put it off. Or they convince themselves that the raise, the promotion, the higher income is the real lever to pull. Which it can be, but only if the additional income is being directed somewhere that compounds. On its own, a raise tends to make life a bit more comfortable rather than meaningfully changing the trajectory. And this is the psychological trap worth naming clearly. We feel income. We see it every pay period, we spend it, we relate to it. Wealth in an investment account is abstract, slow-moving, and does not give you the immediate satisfaction that spending does. So we systematically undervalue it, especially in the early stages when the returns feel laughably small. Which sounds straightforward enough until you are the one staring at an account that went up by $300 in 6 months and wondering why you are bothering. What tends to shift for people who cross that 100,000 threshold is not just the math, it is the experience of watching the returns become real. When your account grows by 7,000 in a year and you did not touch it, something changes in how you think about money. You start seeing it less as something you earn and spend, and more as something that has its own momentum. That shift in perspective is worth more than most financial advice because it changes the decisions you make going forward. You stop reacting to short-term noise and start thinking in longer timelines. You become less likely to cash out during a market dip because you've seen what happens when you stay in. Less likely to let lifestyle costs expand every time income rises because you understand what that trade-off actually costs you over time. Less tempted by things that take money away from you without meaningfully improving your life. You start filtering decisions differently. Not just, can I afford this, but what does this cost me in future optionality? And that question alone eliminates a surprising number of bad decisions. The 100,000 is almost like a proof of concept. It proves to you through direct experience that this works, not theoretically, not based on something you read. You've watched your money grow without direct effort, and that changes how real it feels. And once something feels real, behavior follows. In practice, what this means is that the goal worth holding in your mind is not a particular salary number. It is the accumulation of capital that starts working alongside you. A raise helps you get there faster if you direct it well, but on its own, it doesn't fundamentally change the structure. 100,000 saved means you are already participating in the system differently. You're no longer entirely dependent on earned income. Even if the contribution from your investments is still relatively small, it exists and it compounds. That's a different position to operate from. So the focus for most people is better placed on the gap between income and spending, and whether that gap is consistently being redirected into something that grows, rather than simply celebrating each time the income side of that equation increases. Because income on its own is easy to absorb, it disappears into slightly better versions of the same life. Wealth, when built deliberately, changes the trajectory of that life. You can earn a very comfortable salary and still find yourself, 10 years later, needing to work at exactly the same rate just to maintain what you've built. No additional flexibility, no meaningful reduction in pressure. Just a more expensive version of the same structure. Or you can build 100,000 in savings and find that the next 100 takes less time, and the next even less. Not because you suddenly become more disciplined, but because the system starts contributing alongside you. Momentum builds, and that momentum is subtle at first, then obvious, then difficult to ignore. There is nothing wrong with wanting a higher income. Earning more is useful. It gives you options. It accelerates progress if it's used intentionally. But the idea that a raise solves the deeper problem, the feeling of being stuck, of working hard but not building anything. And that's where it starts to fall apart, because a raise improves the flow of money through your life. But accumulated capital changes the structure of your life. One makes things more comfortable, the other makes things more flexible. And flexibility is where most of the real value sits. It's what allows you to make decisions without immediate financial pressure, to take opportunities that don't pay off instantly, to absorb setbacks without everything collapsing. That doesn't come from slightly higher monthly income. It comes from a base that supports you. That's what the first 100,000 really represents. Not just a number, a shift in how money behaves in your life. And once that shift happens, what's possible starts to change with it. If this gave you a clearer way to think about money, subscribe. Because this channel is about understanding how money actually works, so you can stop working for it blindly